Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram and only Stefan Bertram. Coming back to you after quite a long gap, I think. I think it's been 2 weeks that we've missed. I should have had something ready for last week, but I just didn't really think about it. And I think Ben is really been in a state of great busyness. But finally, we're back. I'm perfectly on time, which is probably not it's probably not actually good for viewership, especially early viewership. So most of these words will be directed towards the VOD crowd. But that's perfectly fine. And today I wanted to talk about freedom and order, and why I think there's an idea that freedom and order, like kind of naturally, we think these two things are opposed. But I want to instead suggest that more directly, order and chaos are opposed, which I think everyone would accept basically. But then the less popular idea I want to suggest is the notion that freedom and order go much better along with each other than freedom and chaos do. That chaos is largely antithetical to freedom, and order is largely compatible with it. And then, unfortunately, I thought so. I'm on StreamYard, not on Restream today. This week has been for the past few weeks. I wish there was a solution where I could be slightly larger, but neither on Restream or StreamYard, it seems there's a solution where I can be any larger than this. I can be this big, but then I'm far too big. So I can only be this big, even though this is a completely unnecessarily small amount of size. The claim that order is freedom, or freedom is order, or that there is a close relationship between these things can seem like a very 1984 war is peace kind of claim. But I'm hoping today that I can demonstrate that the claim is in fact more or less straightforward. We need to understand order and chaos and freedom in particular ways, but I also hope that the definitions I give of these three terms will be broadly convincing. Secret Asian Dan in chat said, could it be the order of freedom? I hope so. I think clarifying this point is both useful to understand things metaphysically, to understand freedom in a metaphysical sense, and also to understand freedom in a political sense. And I will be discussing both things, as well as discussing both order as it refers to political order, and how in terms of referring to a metaphysical order. I think this is especially helpful for resolving various confusions around human freedom, especially as it regards an alleged need for human freedom to escape the causal order in order to be free, or for the causal order to operate in a different way, i.e. that it must be stochastic. This is suggestions of various forms of libertarianism, and perhaps today we might be able to kind of push together the two forms of libertarianism, as I'd also suggest that there's a lot of politics, especially kind of anarchist-style politics, which focuses on the idea that that has at least embedded in it the idea that chaos and freedom are kind of go along with each other, and that while there are all these unfortunate symptoms of chaos, it's more about ameliorating these symptoms than anything else. What do I mean by chaos? Chaos, in this definition, is when anything could happen at any point when circumstances are unreliable. Notably, this is not chaos in the entropic sense. This is not a tendency towards more entropy, though it could be relatively associated with it. But notably, in a completely maximally entropic state, things become very boring again, become in some sense very orderly again, because basically nothing can happen. There's just kind of particles floating around in the void with nothing, no greater structure or anything like that. If the world is entirely chaotic, and this again can be in a political sense or a metaphysical sense, then there is no ability at all to predict the world or to have any distinguishable effect upon it. You may be causing certain things to happen, but you wouldn't know what they were. Because in a chaotic world, there's no, in a strictly chaotic world, there's no real causal order. Or if there's a causal order, it's one which you wouldn't be able to tell, because there wouldn't be these particular like events that cause another event, at least in any way that would be obvious. If a person was entirely chaotic, then it would be impossible to ever tell what that person would do. And this is also true for them. It would be impossible for them to know what they were going to do before they do it. Can I move myself to the bottom right? Maybe I can. I can't do so immediately, at least. But I think few slides will have me covering up the text, because that would have caused me to go completely maximum. Freedom. Freedom, I wish to argue today. I wish to kind of stipulate today in some sense. Freedom is existing in circumstances where we have the chance to will certain things and those things to happen in the world at least some of the time. Freedom, it seems clear to me, involves choosing what you wish to do, and that choosing actually goes through at least some of the time. Freedom cannot be just stuff happening, because in that case, there's no real connection between what we will and what happens. We might think of this kind of anarchic life where you get up in the morning, you have no idea what you're going to do next, is some kind of freedom, but to me, it's at very least a thin kind of freedom, which is not desirable and is not free in any particularly full sense of the term. Clearly, this definition of freedom is incompatible with total chaos, but I think this is not a particularly strong or powerful thesis. I think it's not a deeply controversial thesis. What is controversial, I assume, is the idea that freedom has far more to do with order than chaos, and that even in a totally ordered world, freedom would still be possible. What is the connection between freedom and order? There are two halves. One is your possibility of changing the world in a way you can predict, and the other is the possibility of avoiding the world changing you, relating to the metaphysical and political order. Order means that when we do a certain thing, we can reliably expect a certain outcome. That is a requirement of freedom, as we already discussed on the previous slide. If we seek to freely choose our breakfast, but halfway downstairs, one is teleported to the Himalayas, our ability to choose breakfast will likely be interrupted. For one thing, assuming you're traveling from Europe, it will not be breakfast time in the Himalayas. And I suppose if you're in the United States, it will also not be breakfast time in the Himalayas. You'll have to, rather in both cases, I think, supper. There is a certain metaphysical order that exists in relation between cause and effects, between ours and the general structure of the world, which is required for human freedom. We need to be able to predict that, going downstairs will lead to us being in a state that we have breakfast. We need to be able to think, oh, I want cereal, and then to engage in this various set of steps to get there in this metaphysically predictable way, in such a way that this is all kind of predictable and reliable and so on. The other half of this relates to political freedom and order, namely that we don't live in a human situation which is so chaotic that we can't assert our freedom. We seek to freely choose our breakfast, but it's entirely plausible that an anarch gang will have taken over our kitchen, stolen all the breakfast materials, and instead left several live giraffes in there. This lack of political order is a major impingement on our ability to freely choose. There's nothing more frustrating, I'm sure we can all agree, to make a plan for a meal and then to go and find out whoever else has ate your food or it has disappeared or whatever has happened. And this is kind of a disorderly, well, because I mean it's disorderly because of course we can imagine ourselves being stolen from in a reliable way, but while being stolen from in a reliable way is upsetting and certainly can be seen as a violation of our freedom, it doesn't have this direct violation of our freedom where we plan out a set of steps and then this violation happens where we can't go through with it. Jem suggests that giraffe doesn't taste bad, and I think that's likely the case, but a braver man than I would be the one that would be slaughtering the giraffes in the kitchen, especially in not just the sense of kind of, well, I'm not sure I could take them, but also in the sense that it would cause a terrible mess. What is the claim of the intuitive, libertarian, or compatibilist? And I say I put the prefix intuitive here in order to make clear that I'm not talking about like the real libertarian position. I'm not here talking about the kind of actual positions of libertarians, which is defended in philosophy. This is based on the seemingly intuitive idea, the suggestion that we need some kind of chaos in the metaphysical order to be free. This is seemingly intuitive idea that because someone was always, in some sense, always going to do a certain thing, they can't have been free in doing that thing, in choosing to do that thing. To return to breakfast, the idea is that in the metaphysically orderly world, in one particular breakfast incident, a person will always do the same. If we round time, they would do the same thing, so they're not free. If we accept that we live in a deterministic world, then it's true that if we rewound the clock, we would always choose the same breakfast. We round a trillion times. As long as the circumstances didn't change in a deterministic world, that person would always choose the same breakfast. And thus, in a certain sense, they don't have the ability to do otherwise. This is the sense of doing otherwise, which is doing otherwise in identical circumstances. And I think this is often conflated with any sense of doing otherwise. Well, of course, we always, we're constantly engaged in various senses of doing otherwise. Like, on one day I'll have one kind of breakfast, and one day I'll have another kind. I mean, this is funny. I think I might have used the breakfast example before, but I never eat breakfast, and of course that's a free choice that I make, but also one I could do otherwise. The idea then, if things are not metaphysically orderly, then the randomness of the world would interrupt our inclinations, such that sometimes we would choose a different breakfast, even with an identical history behind us. Let's flip this. Let's flip this example. Would we be more free in a world where anarch gangs, you're free to imagine that these gangs act truly stochastically in a metaphysical sense, occasionally force you to have a different sort of breakfast? The answer is presumably no. So why would we think being interrupted otherwise is freeing? We might have an intuition that in some sense stochasticness would come from us, but it certainly wouldn't come from us in any conscious sense, because the conscious circumstances are identical. It's only these underlying circumstances which are stochastically different. And in this case, whether it's caused by different bouncing of particles or whatever else, different unfoldings of the quantum wave function, it doesn't seem any different to the anarch gang forcing you to do this or that. Are you more free if someone occasionally knocks your elbow while you're trying to put cereal in your mouth. This is important for making evident that you can be more free when you do the same thing over and over again. If you're a very boring person, for instance, take me, I never eat breakfast. Would I be more free if sometimes someone forced me to eat breakfast? It might be the case I'd be better off, but certainly as it regards breakfast, I would not be any more free. I would be less free, even though my choice is the same one over and over and over and over again. As I've already appealed to this kind of variation in breakfast or any other sort of action over time, but it's not clear that this is required, as long as you do so only because you wish and not because you were being made to. Or because you had no freedom, you had no ability to choose otherwise, you weren't in circumstances where you could possibly, you always choose the same breakfast because you can't afford any other breakfast. And the relationship between this and economic freedom is something I'll discuss briefly, if not fully. How orderly should the world be? Political order in this case is a combination of being able to foresee what will happen and what is happening interfering in your life only in expected ways. This condition exists most minimally during the beginning of a civil war, when people are both unable to foresee what will happen and its inability directly leads to maximal unexpected interference in their lives. At the start of a civil war, you will have a lot of groups of only young men going around with guns, wearing strange insignia, and as an ordinary person, it will be a great struggle for you to tell what faction they belong to, what they want, and what they want you to do. You can't predict what they want to do, and because of the circumstances, these various groups will be trying to impose a new order, a new way of doing things, which will lead to them maximally interfering in the lives of the population in various ways that wouldn't usually be the case. We can contrast this with stable liberal democracies. I didn't really put I said but anyway, stable liberals are the clearest example of this, but so this is where circumstances are predictable. Stable liberal democracies are politically orderly because interference happens in expected ways, and we're able to foresee when this change will happen. A perfect example of this is the UK smoking ban. The UK has imposed a smoking ban which is based on birth year. People who were born in 2004 or something will never be able to, not 2004, 2008. People who were born in 2008 or 9 or something, I don't really know. Zoomers or Gen Alphas, whatever. Some young people will not ever be able to buy cigarettes, and that goes for each year into the future. Everyone born after this date will not be able to buy cigarettes. And so this is a limiting of these people's freedom to buy cigarettes, but it's incredibly foreseeable and it's very orderly. It's very expected, it's very foreseeable. It's very particular in how it works. And the exact kind of punishments for violation of this are laid out explicitly in law and have little variation, or should at least have little variation, and so on and so on. In communism, this would be even more of the case, because history is ended and thus politics is at the end. And we are free from a large part of interference in our lives because there is no state and there's no class war. The lack of class war and a state not only minimalizes ongoing interference in our lives, but makes us foresee that in the future, unless some kind of great economic collapse happened, there shouldn't be any more. There should never be a civil war in a communist state, because there shouldn't be the contradictions in it that would require such a thing to come about. There wouldn't be the motivation for various groups to engage in such a thing. So, if freedom has a strong, positive relationship with order, do we want perfect order? What's wrong with order as it relates specifically to freedom? The evident problem with order is when it surrounds circumstances that are otherwise bad. If we can predict what comes in the future and we reliably interfered with, this is unacceptable or acceptable based on whether the present and future are good or bad. Are these the right sort of interferences? Should there be more interferences? I think for many people in the West, they would like the state to interfere much more in the lives of the oligarchs who rule over us, though they might otherwise want less interference. When things are bad, then order is perceived negatively, as nothing ever happens, and we instead desire towards billions must die, and various kind of hysteria about wanting history basically to crash down upon our heads just because our lives and our political order is both dull and bad. But again, to return to the communism example, communists can back order much more than liberals can, because communists foresee an end to politics, where liberals must always wish for flux. Liberals, especially contemporary liberals, always insist on multi-party democracy. They don't foresee that there could just be one party that would kind of solve politics and lead things to an end. No, rather than like, no, that all has to always be politics. Politics has to go on and on and on, and this necessarily leads to a changing system, interference, as society progresses, or well, not progresses, really just goes, and has a tendency for this interference to increase. I've talked about a degree of interference in life, but I would say that my definition of order here is either not to do with that, or at least not directly to do with that. Order is merely that there is an orderly manner of interference. And I think this is probably the right way to understand it. We could argue that a more orderly system is a more interfering system. I think this is because interference doesn't only come from the state and similar entities. There's always interference in our lives from below, especially from antisocial people. We might be interfered with by cruel and emotionally incontinent and blah, blah, blah neighbors. And in this case, the kind of orderly interference of the state or other entities upon this neighbor in order to solve this problem is seen as more orderly. State-based intervention is generally considered more orderly because at least it comes from a single source. And this single source, as I've already mentioned, normally has explicit definitions and laws about when it will and when it will not interfere. But this brings us to kind of discussing the whole structure of the rule of law as it relates to the state. The rule of law here meaning the idea, which is, and it's quite a strange one historically, the rule of law is the idea that there should exist this clear, explicit, defined law which should only interfere with people such that it interferes with everyone the same. That if you do the same thing, regardless of your status, the same sort of thing should happen to you. And as obviously, as we're all aware, this is something which is never entirely true, especially as regarding members of the ruling class, of the elite. They can get away with a lot more than other people. And as well as like racialism and racism, sexism and so on, the rule of law is deployed unequally. But much more than any other historical era, modern bourgeois liberal states have this rule of law, though we may worry that at present it's something which is very much under threat. It seems that but not long before the rule of law follows after the state. That's a really awkward sentence. It seems that as soon as we get a state, a proper state, not like the medieval, I don't call it a state, but I think some people do, but I mean the states of modernity and the states of ancient empires like the Roman Empire. It seems that not long after we get a state, we get the rule of law, and letters cachet, which were used as a tool for the French absolute monarchy to try and control the situation in France in the pre-revolutionary period, are more of a crisis of this modern state than its normal form. But on the other hand, or kind of dialectically with each other, states almost always have zones of exception. However, when the rule of law does not apply, and this is often in explicit terms, I mentioned already that kind of that the elite can get away with more and whatever, but normally in these cases, this is a violation basically of the explicit rule of law. But states will often have situations, zones of exception, where they rule these areas in de facto or de jure terms, but the rule of law explicitly does not apply in these places, or at least does not apply in the same way with the same laws as it does in the metropole. So, for instance, there are like some threats to rule of law even in kind of the metropole. Like recently, there's a drama in the UK because judges are pushing for like minority. Oh, it's a very complex. It's just silly. I don't think it's worth explaining. But basically, there's I'm not going to explain it. And I should mention that for even if the rule of law only does not apply in like a significant minority of cases, it doesn't apply at all. A slight violation is a very seriously threatening one to the rule of law because the whole basis of the rule of law is its universality. Without its universality, without the idea that these rules apply equally to everyone, then there's nothing there. These zones, which I've spelled as zooms, can be spatial or temporal and are normally outside of the metropole or within some kind of like isolated spatial zone within the metropole. Metropole being like the homeland of a nation, like not the British Empire, but rather Britain, whatever. The United States, not Puerto Rico, or so on and so on. And I think a useful case study here, which will bring us back around to the topic of freedom, is the Troubles in Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland. Colonies were always states of exception. Basically, that was kind of how colonies were structured. The whole kind of point of a colony was that it was governed and ruled in a different way to the metropole, and states of exception were much more likely to appear there, as well as the whole thing inherently being a state of exception in the sense that some certain things, like you could never ever vote to elect an MP if you weren't living within the British metropole. If you live in any other part of the British Empire, you would not be able to elect a MP to the UK Parliament. But these states of exception intensified in their temporal, in like the space they covered, as well as kind of the length and intensity of these violations in the post-World War II crisis of empire. So you had the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, where there was this real vicious anti-insurgency campaign, and what was very politely in Britain called the Malay Emergency, where Britain prosecuted a very significant, brutal and bloody kind of anti-communist insurgency in Malaya mainly against the Chinese minority there. And basically, very soon after these struggles were finished, the Troubles began. So there was only this very brief period where Britain did not have this major zone of exception. And it is notable to say that a large part of why the crisis in Northern Ireland began was because the rule of law didn't fully apply them and their situation. The Catholics did not have full social and legal rights in Northern Ireland, though in large part this was not something that was formally enforced in British law by the mid 20th century, but rather something that was enforced by like a local elite clique working to do, well, it's similar to what happens in the American South, where, I mean, eventually the American South did pass a lot of explicit laws, but a lot of it was also working around what they could do with federal law, like stuff like the poll laws, poll tax and so on, where, okay, everyone has to vote, but why don't we're allowed to impose these certain kind of restrictions, so let's just make like a bullshit test for black people. Why was Northern Ireland placed into a state of exception? Because the situation had become disorderly. Catholics were not willing to countenance their continued orderly oppression, and that is the thing. So while in large part, to a large degree, the rule of law was being violated in Northern Ireland, the situation was genuinely very orderly. The people were being oppressed, but they were being oppressed in quite an orderly way. In order to deal with the new disorder, the rule of law was suspended. Very explicitly in Northern Ireland, they imposed internment, where in a violation not just of kind of modernist law, but something which is going back hundreds of years, people were imprisoned, not only having not been convicted, but often not having been charged with anything. They were simply interned. As well as there were kind of less explicit violations of the rule of law, and imposition of states of exception, where like paramilitaries and so on hired by the British state, as well as kind of special forces, would engage in various crimes in the north of Ireland in an attempt to repress this disorderly rebellion. And this is the question at hand, is related to order and freedom. Were people more free in the Troubles? If you were an ordinary sort of person, then no, very certainly not. The decline of political order meant you were far less free to live a normal life, which is what most people want to do, and are most free when, in keeping with their desires and their wants, they're able to live this normal life. And the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and this, I'm not applying any normative blame here to any groups, was one where people were not free to do this. They were not free to live normal lives. Well, I mean, some people, everyone in the end, more or less did manage to live such an ordinary life, but there were massive obstacles in the way. Obstacles of, there's not just like street fighting on your street, so you can't like go to the pub or whatever, but there were like very large like travel restrictions, and large parts of Northern Ireland became no-go zones depending on your citizenship, your religious identity. And, and of course, a small minority of Northern Irish civilians ended up getting summarily executed, which is a very decisive loss of freedom. If, on the other hand, you were an angry young man who wanted to kill people, and then you were far more free. But this should make us know that not all freedoms are born equal. Some can only be achieved by the destruction of the freedom of others, and not freedoms a virtuous person desires. Obviously, I have been a young person that had a gun in a civil war and so on. But ultimately, I would rather that whole thing never have happened, was never required to have happened, and that we all live in communism and so on and so on. Or even we all just live in bourgeois liberal states where there aren't genocidal groups like ISIS, rather than me getting to be a young person with a gun. I don't say young angry person with a gun because I wasn't particularly angry, but I did in fact have a gun and I was in the Civil War. Political instability is not a time of freedom for most people, and while freedom can emerge out of it, this is an imposition of a new order. And so eventually the situation in Northern Ireland became more free, but this was not during the Troubles, it was after the Troubles. after the kind of large degree of success of the Provisional IRA's guerrilla campaign, led to the British state basically enshrining in Northern Irish law and forcing through in Northern Irish law and British law in general a state where, to the greatest degree possible, this very strong rule of law and this kind of stringent political order which interferes, which like forced political parties across the divide to work together and so on. Order doesn't explain everything, but it does explain something. The point of this exercise is not to prove that order is freedom, nor to explain everything about freedom, nor to say, nor to claim that everything about freedom can be explained through a positive relationship to order, but rather order is more often a positive force as it regards freedom rather than a negative one, which is not explained by it. For order is compatible with different levels of intervention, and economic freedom, while having a relationship with order, cannot be entirely explained by it. That is the conclusion of the PowerPoint, and I would normally answer questions now, but not that many people are watching, so that probably won't happen. But I did want to talk a bit more about economic order as it relates to freedom. I didn't include this really on the PowerPoint. There were bits I included in my notes, but mostly they were kind of interspersed and didn't kind of they weren't in full slides, so they weren't really justified. But I think an interesting point to remark on is regarding like economic order and freedom is inflation. And inflation, if you're a poor person and you live in a country where wages are increasing reasonably in pace with inflation or slightly higher, and you are personally receiving these increases, then inflation is like objectively good for you, or at least fine for you, because what it mostly does is dilute kind of large savings and favors you, the person who doesn't really have anything. But everyone fucking hates it. Everyone hates inflation so much because it is disorderly, right? It leads to circumstances where you aren't expecting something to be the case. Back in the day, this meant going to the shop with £4.50 and thinking you can buy X and finding out you can't buy X and you can only buy Y instead because the price of it has increased. And now that people use cash, this is still happening. I don't really know particularly why, but for lots of people, I never do this, but it seems that people are often constantly transferring money between different bank accounts. And so if they haven't transferred the right amount and they go to the store and they find the wrong amount is there, then they have to do this embarrassing thing on their phone where they change things back and forth. And economic freedom, I would say, also has a significant relationship with order, though not one I would want to too severely overemphasize, where a lot of economic freedom, if you go back to the Brexit example, is being able to go to the store and buy the thing you want. It's being able to afford your rent or to afford your mortgage. And a lot of this has to do with the reliability of the economic order. It has to do with you being able to stay in a certain job and getting paid the same amount each month. And that same amount each month is worth the same thing. People hate more nowadays because labor power is so weak that workers couldn't get compensatory pay rises to offset the effects of inflation. I think that certainly is true, and it may be true in the United States that they're going through like some kind of stagflation. But since COVID, wage growth in the UK has been really high, but people don't feel any better off, in part because they aren't any better off because of inflation, but in large part because inflation just feels bad. I think prices going up always feels worse than your wages going up feels good, because we value money more. Like, we want to value money. We want money to be valuable. We want our money that we currently have to be valuable. And inflation just dilutes that in this unpleasant way. And especially kind of like it forces us towards nostalgia. Like, the fact that things used to be so cheaper in the past appears to us more forward in our minds than the fact that the minimum wage used to be absolutely fucking nothing back in the day. But of course, the United States has had the same federal minimum wage for, I don't actually know, a very long time. My whole life, certainly my whole political life, it's been exactly what it is. I actually don't know when it last went up. Does maximizing freedom via maximizing social order using totalitarian crackdowns a la Mollberg count? Definitely not during the crackdown, which would inevitably be massively disorderly. In large part because people never just lie down and take it. But it's not clear that when someone like Mollberg talks about freedom, they mean freedom in any reasonable human sense. What these people normally mean when they say freedom is nothing more than freedom for capital. And that's something I've never cared about. $19.99, according to Jen, was the last time the US minimum wage went up. It will probably be strange for Americans, but the UK minimum wage goes up every year and is really, really high now. I mean, we have a lot of problems in the UK, and it's a decaying kind of depressive country, which is going completely to the dogs and will never stop going further to the dogs. But our minimum wage is very high. What's the minimum wage going up to? Minimum wage 2025. The minimum wage is going up to $12.21 in April, which $12.21 in USD is $16 an hour. So in the UK, we will have that American long claimed for $15 an hour minimum wage, which now has been the slogan for so long on the American left that it's become a bit out of date. I think that actually $15 an hour would now be pretty crap. And you probably want more like $20 minimum wage or something like this. I can get rid of this now, can't I? I can make it smaller anyway. Yeah, I mean, Ben Zer said maybe buying power can be counted as minimum wage hour units. I think there's certainly ways where people could be made to hate inflation much less. That we just use money in a different way. But as long as we use money in the way we do, as long as money is structured in the way it is, then I think people will always hate inflation. Thermal poster, that's true, but I do think it's a slightly compelling nugget in the anarcho-tyranny argument. Yeah, I think there's like anarchist tyranny is an idea which is less strange than you think. Like, and this isn't just kind of like the horrible whatever blah blah fake anarchism of like the weird far right libertarian people, but also something which is you can quite clearly see in left wing forms of anarchism, where people will be like, okay, but in the case of there just being this horrible antisocial individual who in our present society would certainly go to prison, this kind of unredeemable, violent person, not necessarily like actually committing like murders. Maybe they will eventually at some point kill someone, especially if people try to stop them doing their various things. But generally what they do is they just make people miserable. And the anarcho-communist solution to this if they're being realistic, they're being genuine and honest, not just saying like, actually, we'll just make them better, is to say that either A, this person should be expelled, but in that case, that just becomes someone else's problem, or B, he should just be killed. And obviously, both of these things, either exile or killing, are both highly tyrannical kind of solutions to the problem. I think there's this interesting relationship where the degree to which you want to abolish the state and thus abolish interference, without a reliable order of interference, what this leads to, even in quite like optimistically arranged anarcho situation, is that when these severe violations of social code happen, you only have extreme solutions. Well, rather say, you only have weak solutions or really extreme ones. You don't have the options in the middle that we have in our society where we forcefully detain these people and optimistically try to fix them, but in reality, prison as it currently exists mostly makes people worse. It was raised in 2006. There's Uri, or Jem says it was 2009. Oh yeah, that's a crazy one. There's also a sub-minimum wage in the US, $2 an hour or something like this for tipped workers, which is nuts. Yeah, and of course there's the US slave labor system. What was this in reference to? Yeah. I clicked my knuckles just before going on stream, and it was like, oh, it was such a click. Oh, fuck. Oh, what to do with the antisocial individual? I mean, obviously, it's not a problem for the anarcho-communists. They would just say that is not a proper arrangement in society, and we are legitimate in abolishing that relation. But obviously, yeah, it's probably the most classic problem for libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, where it's like, okay, but what if there's just some company who just dumps on their sovereign terrain? Like, because an essential part of the libertarian anarcho-capitalist worldview is that you can divide up the world into like truly sovereign plots, and these plots are much smaller than our current arrangement of plots of kind of nation states or whatever. And so we do have problems in our current state where like Turkey can turn off the taps using dams and so on to countries downwind of it in Syria and Iraq and so on, using their control of the mountain ranges. But in an anarcho-capitalist society, this would be just intensified by 10,000 times. And of course, it's reasonable, I think, even for libertarians to say that, like, okay, someone turning off the tap at the top on a dam or something could be a violation of your freedom down the road from them. Though it's not clear how you could reasonably interfere with them in such a way which wouldn't just be really horrible if they were obstinate. And probably just leads to you having to pay them some kind of tax for them not to do that. But then you get into problems of something like pollution, where it's like, okay, how do you adjudicate that? If there's these people, like, and I don't just mean kind of global pollution as we currently understand it, but like local pollution. If someone's polluting the river such that the water becomes undrinkable, that's the same thing as if they turned off the tap, but it's much more kind of ephemeral, and it's not clear who can be blamed, because everyone that's using the river is going to be partially polluting it. And it's like, you just end up reinventing a river authority at some point, which really makes the whole enterprise a bit pointless. Yeah, I mean, talked about it a bit in terms of I didn't. It wasn't talked about in unjust, but rather in terms of bad. I just said bad. That yes, one of the ways which freedom. Well, it's not necessarily even freedom, but we can be dissatisfied with the present order, um, and that's bad. We can genuinely be dissatisfied with a certain order, and that's problematic because kind of the more orderly an order is, it can often be the hardest one to interfere with. But in the case of like a civil war, which is this kind of most disorderly kind of situation, groups that want to change things have the most chance to actually interfere with matters. That's the thing, like, and this is kind of the big Marxist point, right? That feudalism doesn't work once you globalize the economy, right? Um, Once you have the significant ability for your large factory to interfere in a really legitimate and real way with someone 100 miles away without directly touching with them or interfering with them, things become really, really complicated. I mean, actually, though, of course, in feudalism, they did have an incredibly complex ecosystem and all these kind of carve outs in each other's other territories. And maybe, yeah, maybe an even more complicated Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, is the solution to kind of ANCAP and libertarian problems. Mm. I mean, I don't think Robert is entirely wrong about the idea that money kind of evolved organically. I mean, there's two things, right? In capitalism and in earlier models of production, though to a lesser degree, you would inevitably have money or something like money. You'd have to have money. The system wouldn't, capitalism would not work on a barter basis. And if we disappeared all the currency in the world, all people would do is the next day invent something new. Um, so this also disproves kind of the libertarian and ANCAP obsession with gold and silver, where if all the gold and silver in the world disappeared, the next day people would just be using something else. And this is true for when the gold and silver standard were universal. I mean, probably in medieval times it would cause like a lot of genuine problems. Where it would be like, well, what can we value now? And it would probably lead to like, I wouldn't be surprised if it led to like right, big social problems. But eventually people would adapt. The money form would just take some other form. So it's true that money would necessarily basically emerge, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that the actual history of money is one which is uninterfered with by various political and legal authorities, which specifically formed money in such a way as to serve them. Like, of course, royal mints and so on, there was a desperate desire for these states and pre-states to have a control of only we can make money. Because, of course, then you could literally print money. And that meant that the punishment for people who wanted to who made like fake coins was horrible, painful death. It was like one of the worst crimes, and it stayed that way basically until it became very hard or basically pointless to make fake money. Order is necessary but insufficient. Yeah, I'd say that's true. Um, I think my point was basically is people would make the opposite point that there's at least an appeal to some people, maybe people that haven't really thought about it, or maybe plenty of people that have, is that order is basically always an interference with freedom. I thought Jason had responded really late to me asking, "We're still in StreamYard, right?" But no, he just posted an article in the group chat. Uh, Yeah, and kind of probably the only complex societies um, that didn't really use money that much were the ancient Bronze Age civilizations. But they did that in this incredibly, they only avoided using large amounts of money by having this kind of a social structure which would most similarly remind us of like Stalinism. But of course, Stalinism ran completely on money. Um, where things were dictated at such a strong level from the top down in terms of when people should be growing plants and so on, and distribution of seed reserves and so on. But what's notable here is that the Bronze Age civilizations were the only ones in history that really collapsed, that really cataclysmically had an actual apocalypse. And this is surely because they were so top down. The only one that didn't fully collapse was the Egyptian civilization, which just instead had a horrible, horrible time for a long period of time, but got through it and changed their model of state making and so on. Okay, everyone, I am going to knock off. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for getting active in the chat. Once I like basically asked people to start getting active in the chat, meaning we can make this an hour episode. I was thinking, like, when people weren't getting active in chat, I was like, oh, but this will be an interesting experiment because it would be good to know if a short video would actually do better. Because I normally when I post in like the group chat, not the TIR group chat, like personal group chats with me, with like a 1 hour video, I'd really like people to watch for like, well, I don't have an hour. Like I don't watch hour-long videos. So I was wondering if like a 35-minute video would do better. But then you lovely people came along and said stuff. And so we're back to just 1 hour again. So bye everyone. I'm going to set the outro video. Oh, should I do the non-cartoon one for once?